Grady Holt found the dollar bill taped to his gas tank on a Saturday morning in October, and for a moment he assumed the wind had done something strange with a stray bill loose from somebody's pocket. Then he saw the tape, 4 small pieces, one at each corner, pressed down with the kind of care that meant somebody had knelt in a gravel parking lot to do it right. He peeled it back and found handwriting underneath, block letters pushed hard enough into the paper that whoever wrote them clearly wasn't listening to how loud the pen scratched. For the truck. Still counting. It was the 9th Saturday in a row he'd found one. He didn't know it yet, but finding out who had been taping dollar bills to his motorcycle every week, and why, would lead him to a deaf, widowed veteran running out of savings and time. A debt collector with no patience for a man who couldn't hear his threats, and 118 riders who would make sure Harold Voss never had to count his dollars alone again. Millbrook, Indiana was the kind of flat farm town where the grain elevator was still the tallest thing on the skyline, and everybody's mailbox sat close enough to the road that you could shake a neighbor's hand without leaving your truck. Corn stretched out flat in every direction past the town limits, broken only by the occasional grain silo and the water tower with Millbrook painted on it in letters that had faded to the color of an old bruise. The corner griddle sat 2 blocks off Main Street, its awning faded from 30 summers of sun, the bell over its door held together with electrical tape. And every Saturday morning since March it had been Grady Holt's first stop after 4 hours of turning wrenches at the Iron Vow Clubhouse 2 miles east. Grady was 44 years old, built solid through the chest and shoulders in the particular way of a man who had spent half his life under the hood of something broken. With forearms scarred from hot metal, and a beard he kept short because long beards and running engines had taught him a hard lesson once, early on. His cut carried the patches of the Iron Vow Motorcycle Club, a wrench crossed with a wrench, the symbol of the program he ran himself, called the Wrench Ministry, free repairs, every Saturday, no questions asked, for any veteran or elderly resident of the county who showed up with something broken and nowhere else to take it. He'd started the program 9 years ago, after his own father spent the last 2 years of his life choosing between blood pressure medication and keeping the furnace running, too proud to ask his son for help, and too stubborn to explain why until it was almost too late. Grady had sworn, at that funeral, that nobody in this county was going to sit alone with a problem they were too proud to name if he had anything to say about it. He'd noticed the first dollar back in August and assumed it was some kid's idea of a joke. By the 3rd week, he started paying attention. By the 9th, he'd started asking around, the waitress inside, the gas station clerk across the street, anyone who might have seen who came and went near his bike on a Saturday morning while he was inside eating eggs. "There's a deaf gentleman drives an old Ford," the waitress had whispered to him that morning, glancing toward the window like she wasn't sure she should be telling him at all. "Comes in early sometimes. Doesn't say much. Lives out on Route 9. Before we get to who left that note, if you're new here, hit subscribe so you don't miss the rest of this story. Because what Grady found at the end of that trail wasn't a mystery he solved for the fun of solving it. It was a man who had been quietly drowning for months without a single person in town noticing. Now, back to the beginning. 3 Saturdays before that 9th dollar appeared, Harold Voss was 79 years old, and he had not heard another human voice since April of 1968. When a night outside Denine took his hearing in the same half-second it took his best friend Freddie Lindvist's life. He still dreamed in sound sometimes, Freddie's laugh, his own mother calling him in for supper, the particular creak of the porch swing back home in Millbrook, and woke every time to the silence that had been the only constant in his life for 56 years. He read lips well enough to get by, and he wrote notes when lips weren't enough, in block letters pressed hard into the paper. a habit from a life spent making sure people understood him the first time, because he could never be certain there'd be a second chance to explain. His wife Miriam had learned sign language for him within a year of meeting him. Back in 1971, at a Sunday social neither of them had wanted to attend, and for 49 years she had been the only person on earth Hal never had to write a note for. She died 3 years ago. A stroke on a Tuesday morning while she was watering the rose bushes she'd planted the year they bought the house on Route 9. Hal still watered those roses every morning himself now, still kept her gardening gloves on the hook by the back door exactly where she'd left them, and still set 2 cups down for coffee before he remembered, some mornings, that there was only one of him now. He'd rigged a doorbell to a lamp years ago, pressed the button outside, and a light in his front room flashed instead of ringing, because knocking had never once reached him, and he'd grown tired of neighbors assuming he was ignoring them. It was the only way anyone could reach him at all if he wasn't looking directly at them, and even then, most people gave up after one try and left without a note, which Hal had long since stopped taking personally, or told himself he had. 6 months ago, his 1988 pickup's transmission gave out on Route 9, the only vehicle he had to get to his dialysis appointments 3 times a week at the clinic 18 miles south, and a flyer at the VA office had told him about a Saturday program that fixed things for veterans at no charge. He'd had it towed there on the last of his savings, written a note explaining what he needed, and watched Grady's crew replace the transmission over the course of an afternoon while he sat on an overturned bucket in the corner of the garage, unable to hear the radio playing or the men laughing at something one of them had said, but grateful all the same for the noise he could feel through the concrete floor. When Hal tried to pay, Grady had torn the invoice in half in front of him and told him, in a note written back, that the Wrench Ministry didn't take money from veterans. Hal had gone home that day grateful and, underneath the gratitude, quietly ashamed. He had never in his life taken something for nothing, not from his own government, not from the army that took his hearing, not from anybody, and he did not intend to start now at 79. So, he began setting aside $1 a week from his disability check, all he could spare without missing a meal, and every Saturday morning, when he knew Grady would be parked at the corner griddle, he drove the fixed truck into town early, taped the dollar to the gas tank himself, and walked away before anyone could see him do it or thank him for it, because being thanked was somehow harder to bear than being ignored. He was $3 short of paying off what he decided, on his own, that the repair was worth, when Roy Fenwick knocked on his door. Hal never heard the knocking, of course. He saw the porch light flash, once, twice, 3 times in quick succession, faster and more insistent than the mailman ever bothered with, and when he opened the door, a man in a gray suit was already holding up a folder like it was a badge. Roy Fenwick was 39 years old and worked collections for Meridian Recovery Solutions, a firm that bought unpaid medical debt for pennies on the dollar and made its money convincing people they owed more urgency than they actually did. He drove a leased sedan a size too nice for his salary and kept a laminated script of pressure tactics in his glove box that he'd long since memorized well enough not to need. He had called Hal's number 11 times over 6 weeks and left 11 voicemails Hal had never once heard, because a phone that only rings is invisible to a man who can't hear it ring. As far as Fenwick's file was concerned, Harold Voss was a debtor who had ignored every attempt at contact, which made him, in Fenwick's experience, an easy one to pressure in person. "Mr. Voss," Fenwick said, loud. The way people got loud with Hal without understanding that volume had never once helped. "I've been trying to reach you for 6 weeks." Hal watched his mouth, caught perhaps every third word, and held up one finger before going to fetch his notepad from the hall table. When he came back and offered it, along with a pen, Fenwick didn't take it. "I don't have time for that," Fenwick said. "This is a $6,400 debt from an ambulance transport 14 months ago, and Meridian is prepared to pursue wage garnishment against your VA disability benefit if this isn't resolved today." He said it fast, the words running together the way people's words always ran together when Hal most needed them slow. Hal shook his head and pointed at the notepad again, mouthing carefully, "Please write." Fenwick sighed. The particular sigh of a man who considered patience a resource he wasn't paid enough to spend, and instead pulled a single sheet from his folder and set it on the porch railing. "Sign here," he said, tapping the line hard enough that the pen skittered. "Voluntary payment plan, $40 a month straight out of your benefit check. Sign it now, and this all goes away." Hal picked up the paper and tried to read it, his eyes moving slowly over language built by people who were never in a hurry to be understood. His hands had begun to shake slightly, the way they always did now, when he felt cornered by something he couldn't fully see coming. "Please," he said aloud, in the flat, uncertain voice of a man who could feel his own words but never hear them. "Slow down." Fenwick checked his watch. "I've got 4 more of these today," Fenwick said, and reached over and closed his hand around Hal's wrist to guide it toward the signature line, the way a man moves something that has stopped being a person to him and started being a task. That was when a truck pulled into the gravel drive and Grady Holt got out. He'd spent the last hour finally getting an answer from the gas station clerk, an old man, deaf, drives a beat-up Ford, lives out on Route 9, and had driven straight there on instinct, still holding that $9 bill folded in his shirt pocket. He saw Fenwick's hand on Hal's wrist from 30 feet away. He didn't rush the walk up the driveway. He never rushed, but something in his jaw set the way it hadn't set since his father's funeral. "Let go of his hand," Grady said. 5 words. Fenwick straightened, unbothered at first, the way men in his line of work usually were. "This is a private financial matter, and you're trespassing on. He asked you to write it down." 7 words. "You didn't. I don't have time to accommodate every." Fenwick started. "Write it down." 3 words, and something in Grady's voice made Fenwick's jaw close around the rest of his own sentence. Hal stood between them, watching both their mouths, understanding perhaps half of what was happening, but recognizing, with a clarity that needed no sound at all, that somebody had finally stepped between him and the thing that had been pressing down on him for 6 weeks. He didn't know this stranger's name yet, only the cut on his shoulders and the calm of a man who clearly did this kind of standing often. Fenwick recovered his composure the way men like him always did, fast and with volume, as if raising his voice for a man who couldn't hear it was less about being understood and more about being obeyed. "You have no legal standing here. This man owes Meridian $6,400, and I have every right to secure a payment agreement." "He owes the VA nothing," Grady said. "That ambulance ride should have been covered under his service connection. Somebody's clerical error turned into your paycheck." "That's not my problem to sort out," Fenwick said. "My job is collecting. Your job today is leaving." 4 words. The porch went quiet enough that Hal could see, in both men's faces, that something had shifted even without hearing a single word of it. He didn't know exactly what Grady had said. He knew, the way a person knows weather changing before the first drop falls, that he wasn't standing there alone anymore. Fenwick's confidence cracked, faintly, and he reached for his phone instead. "I'll have my supervisor documenting this interference. You want to make this difficult? I'll make sure the county knows your club's been harassing a legitimate business." "Go ahead and call him," Grady said. "While you're at it, check the road behind you." Fenwick turned, phone still in hand, and that was when he heard it, low at first, easy to mistake for a tractor 2 farms over, except it didn't fade the way a tractor eventually does. It built the way weather builds, steady, gathering, rolling in off the flat 2-lane roads that fed into Route 9 from 3 directions at once. "What is that?" Fenwick asked, and for the first time all morning, something in his voice had gone thin. Grady didn't answer. He didn't need to. Engines, first, and then chrome catching the gray October light along a mile of open farm road, 118 motorcycles rolling toward the Voss house in a loose, disciplined column. Riders who'd left the clubhouse 20 minutes earlier for what was supposed to be an ordinary Saturday poker run and were now converging on a gravel driveway instead, because a single text from Grady had rerouted every one of them without a second thought. Farm dogs 3 properties over started barking before the column even came into view. They filled the drive, the shoulder, the empty field beside it. Engines dying one after another until Route 9 held nothing but the tick of 118 cooling engines and a silence deep enough that Hal, who could not hear it, still felt it settle over the yard like weather of its own. A vibration in the porch boards under his feet that told him, more clearly than any sound could have, that something enormous had arrived on his behalf. Not one rider looked at Roy Fenwick. Not a single glance in his direction, as though the man standing on Hal's porch with a folder in his hand had already stopped mattering to the only people who now filled the yard. 2 houses down, a neighbor who'd lived beside Hal for 11 years without ever learning more than a wave hello stood frozen on her own porch. "Would you look at that?" she whispered to no one, both hands pressed over her mouth. A man climbed off the lead bike. Duke Callahan, the Iron Vows chapter president, 58 years old, gray at the temples, a patch over his heart for a brother who hadn't come home from a different war, a different decade. He'd ridden with Grady for 11 years and had learned, the way most of the chapter had, to trust a rerouted Saturday text without asking why until he got there. He walked past Fenwick without a word and stopped in front of Grady. "Heard you needed us," he said. 4 words. Then his eyes found Hal, standing on his own porch, watching 2 men's mouths in understanding, at last, exactly how large the answer to his silent request had turned out to be. Something in Duke's weathered face softened, the flat readiness of a man expecting trouble shifting into something gentler. He turned so Hal could see his mouth clearly and signed, slow and careful, the only phrase he'd bothered to learn from a chapter brother's deaf daughter years back. "You're safe." Hal's hands came up to his mouth. He didn't cry, not yet. He only nodded, the way a person nods when 56 years of silence has finally been answered by something louder than he ever imagined a kindness could be. Fenwick did the math the way men like him eventually always did, once the math stopped favoring him. 118 riders. A supervisor who wasn't going to authorize a fight against that kind of exposure over a single disputed medical bill. A county that would hear about this by Monday regardless of what he did next. He folded his paperwork, muttered something about following up through proper channels, and walked to his car without looking at Hal again. He didn't deserve more of this story than that. He didn't get more. By the following month, a veterans advocate from the chapter's network had the ambulance bill corrected at the source, a clerical mismatch between 2 VA departments that should have been caught 14 months earlier, and Meridian Recovery Solutions dropped the account entirely rather than explain in writing why they'd sent a collector to intimidate a deaf man into signing away his benefits. Hal never owed a cent of it, and a letter arrived a few weeks later confirming the debt had been struck from every record that mattered. Grady drove out to Route 9 himself 2 Saturdays later, knocked properly this time so the porch light would catch it, and handed Hal an envelope with $9 bills inside. The ones he'd been taping to the bike all along returned. Hal shook his head hard and pushed the envelope back across the porch rail. His jaw set the same stubborn way it had been set for 56 years. "Keep counting," Grady wrote on the notepad. "But count it toward coffee. You're buying next Saturday." Hal read it twice, and for the first time since Miriam's funeral, he laughed out loud in his own flat, uncertain voice, the sound he could feel but never hear. He still waters Miriam's roses every morning. He still keeps her gloves on the hook by the door. And every Saturday now, there's a second cup of coffee waiting at the counter of the corner griddle before Hal even walks in. Because somewhere along the way, a chapter of writers decided a man who'd spent 56 years making sure everyone else understood him was never going back to being the one nobody noticed. If this story reached you, if you believe that dignity is worth more than the debt anyone thinks they're owed, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs reminding that silence isn't the same as being alone. Subscribe to Iron Vow Stories so you never miss the next one. And tell me in the comments, how many dollars do you think Hal had left taped to that bike?